Imagine stepping into this vast ancient city for the very first time. You want to understand its history, its culture, the way the streets connect.
Right, you want the whole picture.
Exactly. So imagine you're assigned a tour guide. But instead of giving you a map and walking you through the main avenues, this guide puts you in a windowless van, drives you to 3 specific alleyways, points at a few specific bricks, and tells you, this is all you need to see. You now understand the entire city.
It creates this really fascinating illusion, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, you feel like you've learned something profound because you were physically there, but your understanding is entirely restricted by the itinerary that the guide created. You only know the city they want you to know.
And that tension, right, that tension between a highly curated presentation and actual open exploration, that is the heart of what we're unpacking today. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one.
Yeah, and today we're speaking directly to a very specific listener. If you are a former or transitioning Jehovah's Witness, evaluating what you've always known as the truth is, well, it's an incredibly complex, often overwhelming process.
Absolutely. It's a huge shift.
It really is. So our mission today is to offer a different lens. We're going to examine a foundational piece of literature from a strictly, purely biblical perspective, stripping away the organizational framework to see what the text actually says.
And to do that, we are looking at a really fascinating piece of analysis from a German YouTube channel. It's called Hilfe für Zeugen Jehovahs, which translates to Help for Jehovah's Witnesses.
Okay.
And the perspective of the creators is what makes this so valuable. They're Christians, but they have never been Jehovah's Witnesses themselves.
That outside perspective is everything, because when you're inside a system, the methodology feels invisible.
Yeah, it just feels like normal life.
Right? It just feels like how things are done. So the specific analysis we're looking at was done by a man named Martin Pete. He has deep theological training, decades of experience as a pastor, and he's applying a magnifying glass to the initial lessons of the widely used study book Enjoy Life Forever, or Glücklich für immer in German.
And we should probably establish our tone right away here.
Definitely.
Because we aren't here to attack the character of the publisher who might have knocked on your door. Most people leading these studies are deeply sincere.
Yeah, absolutely.
What we're doing is calmly and objectively evaluating the curriculum they're required to use. So when someone from the Kingdom Hall sits down to lead a new student through Enjoy Life Forever, what is actually happening beneath the surface, theologically and psychologically?
Well, let's start right at the foundation, because the source's first major critique is about what this book actually is versus what it claims to be. It's presented to the public as this interactive Bible course. But looking at the structural framework, Martin's argument is that it functions almost entirely as a catechism.
And that distinction is just crucial to understand. A true Bible course, historically anyway, is designed to teach the red thread of the scriptures.
The narrative flow.
Exactly. It walks a student through the chronological context, the historical covenants, the overarching narrative from Genesis to Revelation. It essentially teaches you how to read the library of the Bible.
Right.
But a catechism is fundamentally different. A catechism is, well, it's a summary of the principles of one specific religious community, usually structured as questions and answers. Its purpose isn't discovery. It's to introduce and validate prepackaged doctrines.
Wow. And you can see that instantly in the opening lessons of Enjoy Life Forever.
So, absolutely.
The source points out that the curriculum relies really heavily on immediate, visceral human needs. So the very first things you study are questions like, why is there so much suffering? How can we escape this current system of things? What are the promises of a future earthly paradise?
It is an incredibly human-centric approach. And psychologically, it's deeply effective because it speaks directly to our very natural exhaustion with the world. Everyone wants peace, security, and end to pain.
Right. But, okay, let me push back on that critique for just a second.
Sure, go ahead.
If I'm a publisher, right?
Yeah.
And I'm trying to start a dialogue with a stranger at their door, I have to meet them where they are.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I can't just launch into the historical context of the book Leviticus. Isn't focusing on practical human concerns first just good teaching? You have to offer a solution to the pain they see in the news every day.
It's an excellent point.
Yeah.
And as an icebreaker, it makes perfect sense. But the source highlights a major theological shift that happens when you build your entire foundational curriculum around those human desires.
Okay, what kind of shift?
Well, by filtering the Bible exclusively through the lens of escaping the system of things, you immediately establish this really rigid, teacher-student hierarchy. The student isn't being taught how to read the Bible in its context. They're being taught what specific verses to pull out to support the theology approved by the governing body.
Ah, I see. So it changes the dynamic from discovery to compliance. You aren't really exploring the text. You're checking boxes to make sure you arrive at the predetermined conclusion.
Precisely. And the source warns that this creates a highly precarious environment for genuine biblical inquiry.
Because if you disagree...
Right. If a student actively questions the material, if they bring up independent biblical arguments that contradict the catechism, they risk having the core canceled entirely.
Wow.
The underlying message is clear. The goal of the study is not mutual exploration of Scripture. The goal is submission to the provided framework.
Which brings up a fascinating logical progression. Because if a curriculum is built entirely around answering human desires for an earthly paradise and, ensuring compliance with a specific organization, it fundamentally changes who the story is actually about.
It really does.
You end up having to sideline the central characters of the Bible to make room for those human concerns.
And this is one of the most glaring observations in the entire analysis. When you look at the early foundational lessons of Enjoy Life Forever, you see highlights of figures like Noah.
Okay.
You see entire sections dedicated to Abigail.
Yeah.
There's extensive discussion about the last days and practical family life. But Jesus Christ is remarkably absent from this foundational overview.
I actually found myself rereading that part of the source because it genuinely shocked me.
It's surprising, right?
Yeah. I mean, how do you construct an introduction to the Bible and skip the central figure of the New Testament? The source specifically notes that the foundational building blocks of the Christian faith are completely missing. The Lord's Prayer isn't there. John 3.16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. A verse that basically sums up the core of the biblical narrative. It's just absent from the beginning of the course. I'm trying to wrap my head around a theology that places a massive spotlight on Abigail, but leaves Jesus in the waiting room. What is the mechanism behind that choice?
Well, the mechanism is about shifting the ultimate goal of the student's faith.
How so?
From a purely biblical perspective, the entire text points toward a direct, unmediated relationship with God through Jesus. That relational connection is the core message. But if your curriculum sidelines the mediator at the very beginning, it shifts the focus away from seeking a person and redirects it entirely towards seeking a place.
The paradise earth.
Exactly. The focus is entirely on the rewards, the gifts, rather than the giver. If your foundational introduction to Scripture frames faith primarily as the mechanism to survive the system of things and, live forever in a restored creation, your faith becomes transactional.
That makes total sense because if the goal is a relationship with the Creator, I don't inherently need a massive organization to manage that.
Right.
But if the goal is obtaining a ticket to a future paradise, suddenly I need someone to tell me exactly what the requirements are to get that ticket. It builds a reliance on the publisher and the literature to tell you how to survive.
Which perfectly explains why the curriculum has to be so careful about how it handles the actual biblical text. To maintain that reliance on the organization as the exclusive guide to paradise, the study material has to curate the Scriptures meticulously.
Yeah.
It's not just about which verses they choose to highlight. It is heavily dependent on where they tell the student to stop reading.
Oh, this brings us to a really powerful concept from the source. The danger of the truncated verse.
Yes, this part is key.
To show how this curation works in real time, the source examines a specific story from the book of Acts that Enjoy Life Forever does include in its curriculum. It's the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8.
And this is an incredibly common text used in these studies, specifically to prove that independent Bible reading is impossible and that organizational guidance is mandatory.
Right, so let's look at how the study book frames it. The curriculum directs the student to read Acts 8, verses 26 through 31. In this passage, Philip is directed to approach a chariot where an Ethiopian official is reading the prophet Isaiah. Philip runs up and asks a very direct question. Do you understand what you are reading?
And in verse 31, the eunuch gives the exact answer the study book is looking for. He says, "How could I unless someone guides me?"
And that, crucially, is where the curriculum typically tells the student to stop.
Right. Just stop right there.
It's like watching a movie trailer that strategically edits out the main plot twist so you fundamentally misunderstand what genre of film you're about to watch.
That's a great analogy.
By stopping at verse 31, the entire takeaway is, look, even this high-ranking official needed a guide. Therefore, you need us to guide you through this material. It implicitly validates the need for the governing body to interpret the text for you.
But the analysis asks a very dangerous, very simple question. What happens to that theology if you just turn the page and read the rest of the chapter?
And this is where the theological house of cards really gets tested. The source uses the Elberfelder Bible, which, by the way, is a well-respected German translation that actually shares a very similar textual basis with the New World Translation. So it uses that to read the complete passage going all the way through verse 38, and the picture changes completely.
It really does. Because when you read the full context, yes, Philip absolutely steps in to act as a guide. The eunuch needed context for ancient prophecy. But what is the actual message that Philip, the guide, delivers?
That's the million-dollar question.
The source highlights a massive theological detail here. In the entirety of this interaction, the text never once mentions the name Jehovah.
So what exactly is Philip preaching as he sits in this chariot?
Well, verse 35 says explicitly that Philip started with that exact scripture in Isaiah, the prophecy about a lamb being led to the slaughter, and he proclaimed to him the gospel of Jesus. He preached Jesus as the fulfillment of the text.
Okay, so the Kingdom Hall study stops at verse 31, completely missing the fact that the guide's entire message was centered on the very person they omitted from their own early lessons.
Yep.
But it goes further than that, right? Because immediately after Philip preaches Jesus, they come across a body of water.
And this is where the contrast between the biblical text and the organizational catechism becomes sharpest. In verse 36, the eunuch sees the water and asks, "What prevents me from being baptized?"
Right.
And in verse 38, he orders the chariot to stop, they go down into the water, and Philip baptizes him immediately.
Let's just pause and think about that from the perspective of someone sitting in a Kingdom Hall. Think about the grueling prerequisites required of a publisher today before they're even allowed to consider baptism.
A little intense.
The months or years of answering doctrinal questions from a textbook, the vetting process by the elders, the mandatory reporting of field service hours as an unbaptized publisher.
And all those organizational requirements are completely absent from the biblical text. The source asks the listener to deeply consider what was actually necessary for the eunuch to be baptized. Based on the complete passage, belief in the gospel of Jesus was the singular requirement. There was no vetting period, no organizational hierarchy to climb. It was an immediate grace-based response to the core message of the New Testament.
Wow. So by truncating the scripture, by basically putting up a stop sign at verse 31, the study book manages to isolate the concept of needing a guide while completely hiding the actual message the guide preached and the immediate baptism that followed.
Yeah.
They show you the locked door to prove you need their key, but they don't let you see that the door was actually unlocked the whole time.
That is the psychological power of curated theology. It creates a deep structural dependency on the key holder. You don't trust yourself to read the text because the text has been presented to you as a puzzle only they can solve.
Which begs the ultimate question for anyone navigating this transition. What is the biblical defense against this? If you are handed heavily curated, truncated material that demands your compliance, how does the Bible actually instruct a student to respond?
Well, the source finds the answer to that in another group of people mentioned in the book of Acts. We find their story in Acts chapter 17, verses 10 and 11. They are the Beroeans.
The Beroean standard. I think this might be the most empowering part of the entire analysis. Set the scene for us. Who were the Beroeans interacting with?
So the Beroeans were listening to the Apostle Paul.
Okay.
This is a man who had a miraculous encounter with Christ, a man who would go on to author a massive portion of the New Testament. He's presenting the gospel to them. But the biblical text highlights the Beroeans as being more noble than others.
Noble.
Yes. And the reason for their nobility is fascinating. They didn't just passively accept what Paul was telling them. The scripture says they received the word with eagerness, but they examined the scriptures daily to see if these things were so.
They fact-checked an apostle.
They really did.
I want to frame this in a modern context because the word noble can feel, I don't know, a bit disconnected.
Sure.
Imagine you're dealing with a world-renowned, famous surgeon. They look at your chart and tell you that you need an immediate, highly invasive, life-altering surgery. No matter how famous that doctor is, you don't just blindly sign the consent form.
Right.
You get a second opinion. You ask to see the scans yourself. You ask them to explain the mechanism of the disease. In the medical world, that isn't considered rebellious. It's considered being a responsible advocate for your own life.
And that is exactly the dynamic the source is illuminating here. The Beroeans were commended by God for being responsible advocates for their own spiritual lives.
Wow.
The core message synthesized here is that a submissive, unquestioning student-teacher relationship is fundamentally unbiblical. The threat of a canceled Bible study if you ask too many questions is a massive red flag, because the Beroean standard actually demands independent verification.
Meaning, you do not just read the 3 verses printed in the Enjoy Life Forever lesson block. You don't just stop at verse 31 because the paragraph tells you to.
You read the whole chapter. You read the chapter before it and the chapter after it. True faith, according to this analysis, requires engaging with the whole Bible, not just isolated proof texts.
Yeah.
The source is actively encouraging you to reclaim your agency. If a teacher tells you a specific doctrine is the absolute truth, demand that they prove it, using the full context of Scripture, without relying on outside organizational literature to bridge the gaps.
Because if a doctrine is truly rooted in the Bible, it should be able to withstand the scrutiny of the Bible. It shouldn't require an artificial, heavily guarded environment to survive.
Exactly. The source is trying to break that fear of independent study. The Beroeans weren't punished for their skepticism. They were praised for their critical thinking.
Let's bring all of these threads together because we've covered the underlying mechanics of how this specific study material operates.
Right, let's wrap it up. To summarize the biblical insights we've drawn from this analysis, the source demonstrates that the Enjoy Life Forever course functions primarily as a catechism rather than an open exploration of Scripture. It is designed to filter the Bible through the lens of specific doctrines.
It's the curated tour of the city that only lets you see 3 alleyways.
Yes. And by intentionally sidelining Jesus in the foundational lessons and focusing almost exclusively on the human desire to escape the current system of things for a future paradise, the material fundamentally shifts the theological foundation.
It really does.
It moves the focus away from a direct relationship with the Creator and replaces it with the transactional pursuit of an earthly reward.
And to maintain control over how you reach that reward, the curriculum heavily curates the text.
We saw that clearly with the truncated story of the Ethiopian eunuch. By cutting the narrative off right before the gospel of Jesus is preached, and an immediate grace-based baptism occurs. The material fosters a heavy, artificial reliance on an organization and a governing body, rather than empowering the student to trust the biblical text itself.
It's a methodology built entirely on keeping the student dependent on the guide, which is why the antidote, the Beroean standard, is so vital. It is the noble biblical act of questioning, examining, and verifying every single teaching against the full, unbroken context of Scripture.
They're claiming your right to read the whole map.
Exactly. If you've been handed a blueprint for your entire spiritual life, but you are only permitted to look at a few carefully selected rooms, it is absolutely your right to ask for the rest of the plans.
Absolutely.
So as you continue to navigate your own journey, we want to leave you with this final thought, building on that concept of the Beroeans. If God openly praised the Beroeans for fiercely fact-checking the Apostle Paul himself against the Scriptures, what happens when you apply that exact same noble curiosity to the literature sitting on your table right now? Could the real truth you've been searching for actually be waiting for you in the very verses they never asked you to read?